Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Industrial Cybersecurity, How to Get Started and Why It Matters to Food and Beverage Producers. It's being organized by FPSA's Technology Network. Before I introduce Matt Hartman, our speaker, I want to let you all know that we're going to be conducting a really quick poll right now, just on your level of knowledge on the topic of cybersecurity. So that's going to launch now, and if you don't mind answering the questions, that would be great. So Matt Hartman, Senior Automation Sales Engineer at Blendtec Corporation and FPSA Chairman of the Technology Network, will be facilitating this webinar. And before Matt introduces our guest speakers from FPSA member company Cybertrawl Engineering, let me just go through a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded, so let your colleagues who were unable to listen to it live today know that they have access to it in the members only section of the FPSA website. All attendees are muted by default, but you will have the opportunity to submit text questions to the panelists today by typing them in the question pane of the control panel. Send them in anytime during the presentation and we'll address them at the end. So I think we're good to go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Matt, I'm going to pass this on over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Dolores. If you're just now joining us, thank you so much. If you're here in our last webinar we had Scott Whitlock from Flexport Automation on the call with us. And three things we came away with was getting a quick ROI on your investment. Picking something you can win with, pick a problem that you want to solve, whether it's, say, a water usage or electricity or some other tangible problem you want to fix, and target that, and then use the idea of the industrial internet of things to start collecting data, give you analytics, and figuring out next steps. Another key takeaway of that was executive engagement, because industrial Internet of Things applications, just by its nature, covers a rather large spectrum of the operation, whether it's process, whether it's utilities, whether it's outside contractors, whether it's administration, whether it's the executive team. You have to have a lot of people involved, a lot of stakeholders, and you want to get them all involved to help drive that ship and continue moving forward. And the last one was to make sure you understand that part of the industrial Internet of Things is really a journey. It's not a destination. You go from problem to problem, and you're continually refining and making things better. So our segue for today's session is really on cybersecurity. Because anytime you start talking about the industrial Internet of Things, this whole security thing starts coming up very quickly. Everybody, or most people, have been hacked. I know I have. I know I've had credit card fraud. I've had also, everybody's had some sort of involvement, and people are genuinely nervous. So I think for today, this is a great conversation to start, furthering the dialogue and the understanding, and really start understanding where you're at on the spectrum of cybersecurity. So for today, we have two panelists from Cybertrawl. We have Jason Lahowski. Jason is an industrial engineer at Cybertrawl, and he specializes in network hardening and cybersecurity assessments. We also have Tony Kushna. Tony is the lead engineer for the Information Systems Group at Cybertrawl, where he has worked since 2009. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So let me just start a little bit. Whenever I saw this slide for the first time, it's kind of overwhelming. You start seeing all the different types of internet threats and risks. And I have to admit, I'm a big fan of the book Countdown to Zero Day, which talked about the Stuxnet virus. So my question is, whenever I start looking at this, where do you start to make sense of all of this? Where do you start looking at this and saying, gosh, where do I start?
Go ahead. Well, I think that one of the important things of starting at this point is that cybersecurity is a very big field, and the risks are equally big. And industrial cybersecurity is one small part of that. So if you look at something like what captivates the news, it's typically consumer information. So it's my social security number was leaked, now my identity is going to get stolen, or my credit card data was taken because they were able to get into the payment system in the Target case. But when you start to look at the details, you start to see that the interconnectivity of systems makes these risks more and more prevalent in spaces where you wouldn't expect them, such as industrial systems. So, for example, in Target's case, it was because an HVAC provider had access to the Target network and had access to their point of sale systems, and that was how the attackers got in. It wasn't a breach at Target itself, it was a provider to Target. And in the same way, industrial systems are often connected to other systems now. The thing is, so a lot of these risks you may not think about as impacting industrial environments, and there are some unique risks, but everything is interconnected, even if we're looking at a small sector of it.
There are a few that
makes a lot of sense to me, because back in the day, I remember being in a plant in Poland, and I connected to one processor in the plant, and because of the network they did establish, I was able to connect to other processors on the other side of the plant, and they actually didn't even know how I did that, and they were like, "Gosh, how did you even do that?" And then I showed them, I was like, "This is how you can connect to other processors." So I see what you're saying, because gosh, once you start, now you're taking your industrial network, you're connecting it to the IT network, and just as in the Target case, there's now a bridge into the industrial world.
On the industrial setting, Ethernet is almost a victim of its own simplicity, where you just plug it in, and most of the time it just kind of works on its own. So at a lot of places, no one really understands the actual implications of connecting all these devices together. So even though it may work, it's really opening up a lot of holes on the security side. And like that was another facet of the Target incident, where what business does the HVAC equipment have on the same network segment as the point of sale systems? That was something else that shouldn't have been there.
It shouldn't have been there, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Do you want to go to the next slide? So whenever I see that slide, I started thinking about Stuxnet, and I started thinking about all the different things that are going on. Do you think you could give a little bit of clarity on the different kinds of threats? Because I didn't understand that till a while back. That threats there are different kinds. Could you help elaborate on that?
So the reason I liked the first slide was it has the mysterious, shadowy figure in the center, and that's who you think of as the threat. And that's certainly who gets the press. And in the case of Stuxnet, or in the case of really any significant breach, it's typically not one person in their basement who's behind it. It's sometimes likely to be a nation state that's very heavily funded, or perhaps a criminal enterprise. And this is who you think of, but that's not the only type of threat that exists. So those types of threats fall into the cyber attacks classification. But if you look at what people are worried about within both corporate and industrial infrastructures, it's typically the latter two things more often. It's your malicious insiders, which could be people within your organization, or it could also be trusted vendors that have some access to your system that maybe you don't have a complete handle on. But sometimes it's just the case of being able to do things that were unanticipated. So in the case of your example in Poland, Matt, that's an example of what's known as a vulnerability. It's a way of interacting with a system in a way that it wasn't intended. So you were able to talk across that network in a way that the designers and the managers of that network didn't expect that you would be able to do. And sometimes you can have a vulnerability like that can be exploited and can cause some of the issues that are in green below. So and these items in green below are things that are specific to industrial control systems. So this is actually taken from you want to classify what is the attacker trying to achieve. And on a corporate network, maybe they're trying to steal confidential information. That's typically not as much of a worry on an industrial control network. However, in the case of Stuxnet, one of the goals was to evade the operators. So they actually had human-machine interfaces that showed that the industrial equipment was working cleanly when in fact it was not.
I think getting back to something that you brought up, which is really interesting, because you're right, is that in this particular situation I was in Poland, the way the network had been configured, it was never, the industrial designers of PLCs and never thought it would be connected in this way. So the security levels aren't there natively in a lot of these plant floor devices, because they were islands of automation. They're supposed to be just completely isolated. It just does its little thing, and life is good. Nobody ever expected to connect to it. And I know people are stunned whenever I could connect to it, and they're like, golly, we never thought it could do that. It's like, yeah, and I'm not a hacker, and I don't play one on TV. But I think that's the takeaway, that on the industrial level, you have to kind of understand that there is just native vulnerabilities in these systems. Is that a good realization, do you think?
I think so, definitely. The industrial devices, once again, their resiliency almost is almost a detriment, where you may very well have 15-year-old equipment on the floor. So where else in your life would you expect a 15-year-old piece of technology to be current with today's standards and protected against today's threats? So that's a challenge unique to the industrial environment, in my opinion.
For sure, I think that's fascinating. And just thinking about the different kinds of threats that you have to worry about, just malicious insiders or cyber attacks, and just knowing that those are different protocols. That you have to think differently of how do you want to defend against that.
And the other thing to think about, Matt, is the way that vulnerabilities are classified is how difficult is it to achieve that vulnerability. So what did you have to do to get access to this network in Poland? Did you simply connect to the network and then you were able to access that device? Did you, and so that's a very base level where there's no barrier to entry. And then you start to get into things like, am I limited to access to the network and that I have to have a switch port procured to my machine before I can connect? Do I need a username and password? Am I limited to a particular zone within the plant to which I'm working and I can't access other areas of the plant? So typically when a control system is set up, you don't sometimes have that separation of duties that you see in an accounting department, for example.
I think that's a really interesting thought. Yeah, you don't, whenever you're building out a plant, you don't think about firewalls between individual rooms, between, let's say, the raw side versus the cook side. You don't think about between, let's say, different parts of the plant having isolation. So is that something that you're seeing more and more of?
I think that's certainly something that people are looking at. Like, how can we add security features to our existing system? So one thing you see there is the use of some sort of two-factor authentication system. So you could have an RFID card that you use to scan into a particular HMI. But that just points to the last one, where it doesn't have to be malicious activity that causes downtime. It could be really just a human error where that's just a part of being human. And I've certainly have my gold star from taking down the plant when I didn't intend to, and it's typically because I had a level of access to the network that could cause that.
Yeah,
I don't think you're a controls engineer if you haven't done something like that. That's a rite of passage, I believe.
And even though Stuxnet or NotPetya, that was another fairly popular one a couple of years ago, those get a lot of media attention, but it's these accidental things that have that far greater probability of causing actual problems.
That's really interesting. If you could take those top three, like the cyber attacks, malicious insiders, human error and intelligence or negligence, do you rate those, like where, like if you were going to start working on one of those first, which would you start on first?
Based on our audience response, I think you're really looking at the human error and negligence piece. You're really looking to establish good security practices within your organization, and this could be things like certainly it's up to the organization to determine what their response to security is. So if we're working with a customer and they have very little password security, that's what's going to be implemented into the system. We can try to influence that, but ultimately that's their risk that they're accepting. So establishing that as a building block is very important, and that's again just are people able to? It's the principle of least privilege. Do people have enough privileges to do their job, and then does that privilege stop? Very frequently, people have privileges to do a lot more than they need to, and the reason for that is ultimately it's convenient because maybe there'll come a day when they'll need that privilege, and they won't have to ask somebody for that privilege to be granted in that scenario. But
I really like that, by the way. I've never heard that expression before, the principle of least privilege.
So really a lot of cybersecurity is about fundamentals first, and then you start to get into the devilish beauty of something like Stuxnet, where you're achieving a lot of things, but you have to really identify those low-hanging fruit to begin with, because someone's not going to go to the trouble of creating something that has so much complexity if they can do it a far simpler way.
Fascinating. Can we go to the next slide? Could you tell me a little bit more what you were trying to say here, Jason?
So SANS, which is probably the most respected security organization across cybersecurity, produces a state of ICS cybersecurity survey each year, and the one for June was just released a couple weeks ago. And this is one graph taken from it. The report is freely available, so you can certainly go grab that if you're more interested. But what this graph is showing is that the number of incidents are becoming more frequent amongst this survey set. And I would also say that this is a fairly small sample size of people that identify as having 50 or more percent of their job devoted to ICS cybersecurity. And I would think that with the composition of much of our audience, they're kind of thinking about it, but it certainly doesn't meet that 50% threshold. So these are incidents that have been identified versus ones that have occurred, because it could be something happened and you just didn't catch it. That's completely understandable. There's a lot of noise on the network.
So obviously the actual numbers of actual incidents are going to be higher than what's reported, and the numbers that are being reported are on their own very high.
How much do you actually see, do you think, people don't want to report for fear of retribution or fear of embarrassment? How much do you think people just say, hey, don't tell anybody we got hacked?
I know myself personally, if I wasn't required to via some regulatory agency, I certainly wouldn't be open to advertising that. You'd almost think it would be inviting more attacks, the publicity you would gain from something like that. So personally, I would try and keep things as quiet as possible.
So then if that's the case, then these numbers would be understated. But the big takeaway that I saw from this is the problem is getting worse. It's not getting better.
And some of this might be explained that they're looking for these events more. So therefore they're detecting more of the events that are occurring. But I think the idea that you're going to kind of be invisible to the world is becoming less and less of a practical thing. This survey also showed that 21% of people use an air gap as their primary way of securing their industrial control system. And the air gap is also known as security by obscurity. But typically what we see when we encounter environments is people will say, yes, my environment is air gap, but then they'll have a way to remotely get into the plant, or they'll need to push this manufacturing data up to their their enterprise systems for some system-wide reporting. So there is connectivity between them. It's limited, but it's typically always there.
It's really interesting though, and it's disturbing in a way, because you look at this and go, gosh, and to me it's overwhelming when you look at where do we start, how do we move forward. So I think that plays well into our next slide here, where you start seeing the simplified security life cycle. Could you walk us through that?
So the first step is assessing what the environment is. And I think that, that may seem very simple, but that's a very important thing. One of the security resources that I like is the Center for Internet Security's top 20 controls. And it's freely available. And those first two controls are, what are the hardware assets on my system and what are the software assets? So that's the beginning of an assessment of your current security posture. And the controls get more complex as you go along, but I think the key part of getting started is starting with something that you can sink your teeth into. If you start with a standard that is 800 pages long, that might be a more difficult project to get off the ground. So that's sort of the first step, Matt, is the assessment piece.
So could you elaborate a little bit more, maybe say something you can sink your teeth into? I'm not sure I really understand what you mean by that.
Well, so the CIS top 20 controls, and you could say these are the things that I want to assess about my environment. That's about 2 pages long. That's going to be easier than looking at the ISA 62443 standards, which are probably 1,000 pages in totality. So that's going to be a harder thing to say. How compliant am I to these standards? But the idea of the assessment is before you can manage the security of your environment, you need to know where you're at and really what your approach to security is. So this would be a discovery process where you're determining things like, how is my network connected to one another, to between devices, and how is my network connected to other networks, such as your corporate? How is my network connected to the internet? Is it connected directly, or is it going through the corporate network to get out there? What types of remote access is there into my systems? How is that protected? Those are the kind of things that you would start with in that assessment step.
Do you think, we were talking about before, it needs to be cyclical. This isn't something you can just do one time and think 2 years from now that those results are still valid. So there needs to be something in place monitoring the environment for changes as well.
And then once.
No, that's good. So is that sort of risk assessment, is that where you might find the exposure like a Target had between the HVAC system and the accounting system? Is that what you're suggesting? That's where you start to find those vulnerabilities?
And it could be, this is where an outside perspective can be helpful, depending on what the the bandwidth is within your organization. You may not have the time to do this assessment on your own, or you might not be able to see some of the risks that you may have had a part in creating. You just have that natural blind spot. So it could be that somebody within Target added this access and didn't realize the complete ramifications of it, and it would, because they were kind of they were in the weeds, they were looking at the trees instead of the forest. So the assessment is taking that broader forest approach and seeing what the big picture is. And yes, you probably will discover things, and that's where the implement security step comes in, where you would start to take some of the things that you've discovered and actually make actionable, take the actionable recommendations from the assessment and create solutions from those.
So does that break down to the life cycle then, if you go over the one on the right? Where is that?
And then, of course, the threat landscape is constantly changing. And not only that, your industrial system is constantly changing. You're adding new devices, you're changing the type of production that you're doing, you're adding a new line, you're retiring equipment. Those are things that you have to manage, and that at some point you may want to take another step back and assess where you're at and see where you're at and how much you've been able to achieve the metrics that you set out to.
For sure, for sure. Do you want to go to the next slide? I know this is a fascinating story, and I can't wait for you to elaborate to the audience on this.
So I think Stuxnet is the most notable industrial cybersecurity attack of all time. However, I wanted to take a moment to look at a specific incident that happened within Food and Beverage at Mondelez International. They're the parent company of Cadbury and Nabisco. They're more recognizable brands in the U.S. And what happened to them was that they were a ransomware target, and it didn't directly affect their industrial control systems. However, it affected their ability to ship out the completed product. So because of the interdependencies in their system, they had what's known as an IT threat take over much of their infrastructure, create this inability for the entire machine to operate. So they couldn't get out the product that they were producing, and created this financial impact of over $100 million. And I think that the downtime was something fairly small, like 2 days. However, that you can see how quickly those costs add up, and that's what every food and beverage producer is looking to do. They're looking to minimize that downtime as much as they can. So when you have a cyber attack that affects what you're doing even indirectly on the industrial control side, it can cause quite a financial issue, and that's ultimately what's going to matter to your company leadership.
So do you see more that? So what I thought was fascinating about this is we always hear about the operational technology as where the big threats, but where it looks like more of the IT side of the world, which became the blockage for the operational side. So the threats are everywhere that can then be bridged to the operational side.
Definitely can be both, especially with the Internet of Things and the desire for people to have more access to production data. If you're not careful, that can definitely be opening up more holes between your enterprise network that your users are on and your production network where that data resides. So you really need to be careful in how that is done. And oftentimes the Internet of Things devices are kind of rushed to market with cybersecurity maybe being a secondary concern. So yeah, it's just definitely something you have to be aware of.
You made a comment about just being careful. Could you throw out just like about, could you throw out, one or two things when you say being careful? What does that mean? What's an actionable item? You're saying being careful with, let's say, industrial Internet of Things deployment. What's one or two things that somebody could walk away from this day and go, oh yeah, I didn't know that?
Sure. Well, one kind of inside baseball thing to systems integration anyway, oftentimes we'll be given a project for a customer, and we'll go on site, and their system architecture, their industrial data center wasn't something that we commissioned. So in order for us to be able to execute our project, they'll give us the access we need to this other system. And occasionally, maybe like the passwords that are in use there might be some permutation of that other system integrator's like street address or something like that. So you have to think that that's probably not the only site where they're using that password as well. So even if, like the partners you're working with, if they're not using good security hygiene practices, other clients of theirs, if they're using the same passwords there are other people that are like totally not related to any kind of relationship with the client company that has admin access essentially to someone else's system. So maybe that's just something that's more unique to the industrial space, where there's such a high priority on convenience. Like we were showing here. I mean, downtime can be very, very it can have a very large impact on the bottom line. So in terms of cybersecurity, maybe that gets pushed aside to make it easier to be able to remote in and solve problems. So yeah, it's just there's just an awful lot to keep in mind.
So one thing I heard though, that just for me was just, and hopefully the audience heard this, of just managing credentials. It's just a simple step, just managing your credentials. What did you call it? Your security hygiene? I thought that was a curious expression. And I also heard about managing the credentials back to the principle of least, I can't read my handwriting, but principles of least privilege. Is that what you were saying, Jason?
Yep.
I like those two. They're simple concepts, but I think those bring a lot of security quickly. I'm going to throw something out here. The other day, I received a multi-factor authentication on my iCloud account, and it wasn't me connecting to it. So that told me that somebody had my username and my password to my iCloud account, and they were trying to connect to it. And so if it wasn't for multi-factor authentication, I would have been hacked. So that gets back to that good security hygiene. And so what I was able to do is immediately go to my computer, change the password, and the threat stopped at that point. But I think that's always good security hygiene of multi-factor authentication, privileges, and just changing credentials.
One other quick point. So if you're working with a systems integrator partner, what guarantees do you have that if one of their employees leaves the company, is their access removed? How is that being managed? What policies are in place at that particular partner to guarantee that people that leave the company don't have access to all their client systems still? That's another concern.
That's a fascinating point because everybody uses outside contractors. Everybody has some valued partner that they're using as a resource. Excellent. Do you want to go to the next slide, please?
So kind of to talk about this a little bit, man, just to touch upon what you said earlier, the idea of cyber hygiene is that it's a responsibility. You need to practice this hygiene to kind of be accepted in this digital world. It's like brushing your teeth. But part of that is, a quick example is I went to a plant and they had a corporate wireless network which required you to authenticate every 24 hours. Well, the employees at this particular plant, apparently they told me they found that cumbersome, and they connected their own wireless router to the network, and they called it no wires, and you could just connect directly to it and you'd have internet access. There wasn't a password or anything. And I noted this in my report, and I tried to find where the router was, but this just shows that it's a balance of this risk and reward. The reward is that they had easy access to the internet, and they didn't have to provide this username and password, so they could, you know, on a break they could get on their iPhone. But they're not maybe considering the risks that were being introduced to the network, i.e., they were basically allowing anyone within view of that Wi-Fi network to not only get on the internet but also get on their control system. So someone could potentially be outside the plant, and they could access that Wi-Fi point and have access to the ICS infrastructure.
And I think isn't that the trick with everything? You know, the risk versus the reward, the simplicity, and what comes with that, unintended consequences, is, I think, a huge takeaway. So I guess we could go ahead and start wrapping this up. You know, what are a few good takeaways, do you think, you'd like the audience to have, actionable items? There's a couple things that you think would be just, you know, that would really help out.
I think there's three main ones. Number one, start with the culture. You know, if like Jason was saying, if all of your passwords are on a sticky note next to all of your operator interfaces, that's probably indicative of a culture problem. As always, there's a trade-off between security and convenience, and you just need to decide organizationally, you know, where you're going to come out on that. And you know, there's nothing necessarily technical getting in the way of that either. That is a people issue that you can get to work on right away. The second one is tie up your low-hanging fruit first, and I guess those are the interface between your enterprise network and your production network. That is a fairly granular thing to kind of get your head around, as well as remote access for all of your vendors. Those are two real main threat vectors for your facility. And the third?
Well, I would just conclude that leadership is going to be looking for ROI, and ROI is very difficult to prove in cybersecurity. But where you can show the greatest ROI is within your security policy. If you have a clear security policy of what the organization's approach to security is, and that's communicated to all of the stakeholders, and this is high and low, you're going to have a better chance of success than any technological solution that you can buy on the open market.
And I think I like that from the standpoint of that we're all responsible for cybersecurity, our home cybersecurity, our personal cybersecurity, and our employer cybersecurity. We're all responsible for protecting the assets of our employers as well as our personal assets. I know at a former employer, they would send us fake phishing emails to test you whether you were paying attention or not, and to just raise your awareness of hey, you just went forward with an email that is a phishing email. You could have revealed some very confidential information. And I like that from the standpoint of making us all aware that this is all of our problem. Do you have any closing comments, Jason, Tony?
Well, thanks for having us, Matt. This was quite the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, Jason, Tony, thank you so much for being with us today. Dolores, back to you.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. We actually do have a question, and it is, what do you do when you run into a plant that won't give you remote access?
Well, I think that it's ultimately up to the organization to determine what their approach to security is. But this again is a risk and reward calculation. There's obviously a lot of convenience that comes with remote access. I think that when I wake up at 3 a.m. and I need to get a plant back up and running, it's also very convenient for me to already know the password without having to look it up or something along those lines. But you have to appreciate the security risks that you're creating, and you either have to be comfortable with those risks or you have to take efforts to mitigate them.
And one other potential threat vector that I don't think very many other people think about, you know, if I were to get a call from a Mr. Simpson working at the Springfield power plant, and he was asking for help, like, something's going on, shut the system down right now. I would say I would probably do it, but how do I know that's actually who that was? It could be anybody making that call saying this plant is having this problem. And like, is there some kind of keyword or any kind of verification in place to guarantee that like a person requesting help is actually who they say they are? So it's kind of taking advantage of your desire to help and be helpful, but that could definitely lead to some consequences as well.
And ultimately, you're responsible for who you let into your network. So I don't think it's impolite to say, what security practices do you have in your organization that will help me protect my network from you?
Those are all great points.
Okay, we don't see any other questions, but we do ask the audience to fill out the very last poll so we can gauge what you learned, if you thought that you learned anything. Your feedback is very important to us. When we close out the webinar, you are going to get a survey, and we'd love you to fill that out for us too. And to the audience, if you have any other questions or you want to get in touch with Tony, Jason, and Matt, just send an email to FPSA and we will get you in contact. Is that, well, oh wait, I didn't even ask. Matt, Jason, and Tony, is that okay with you? If
that is fine. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll try to be of service.
Oh, awesome. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So this is good. This is a good response. If there's no other closing remarks, thank you so much for joining the webinar today. By the way, the slides are available in the handout section, and I have a slide up now for our gratuitous self-promotion for the Process Expo in October. The Technology Network is going to have a meetup and a special session, and I think we're going to continue with this topic of the Internet of Things. So we hope to see you in Chicago. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.